today is the 148th anniversary of the foundation of the Theosophical Society. 148 years ago in New York City at the noted Blavatsky apartment, where there was a stuffed gorilla in the front room that always intrigues me so much. If I could just get into a time machine and go back there and just to see that gorilla would be really worth a great deal, because he also had, as you may recall, he had a plaque underneath that said Charles Darwin. So those people had a good sense of humor. In any event, that was the time when a smallish group of unusual people, many of them of considerable scholarly credentials, and others maybe not, but all sort of on the wild side a little bit, you know, namely the people who went to the very border, to the very frontier of various subjects in order to investigate them, got together, and at the suggestion of one of their members, they formed a society called the Theosophical Society, which went through various vicissitudes and schisms and this and that in these many, many years, but it continued up to the present time and remained the container of the amazing and I think in many ways extremely, ultimately very helpful cultural heritage bequeathed by the early Theosophists led by Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott, Russian and although by then naturalized citizen Blavatsky, and Connecticut Yankee and Connecticut and New York State Yankee Colonel Olcott, who really pulled off, I think, an astonishing historical feat with that society and its influence throughout the centuries, and really the input that it had into the culture right up to the present time. Extremely important. I have, of course, my own personal reasons for being favorable to it also, because upon my coming to this country shortly after New Year's Day of 1952, it was members of the Theosophical Society with whom I was already in touch in Austria, who really took me in and helped me and championed me and eventually inducted me into this lodge here, where we hardly ever had a weekly meeting that had less than 100 people in it, and which gave me the additional advantage that being a feisty young Hungarian, I had all these nice, polite, and well-informed older people there with whom I could argue, which I did to my satisfaction, and sometimes maybe even their satisfaction, but not very often. But let me say my memories of the Theosophical Society that I joined the American section at that time, and the experiences that I had here have been extremely influential in my life, and to my last breath I will be grateful to the fact that there was and there is that society, and that its members had given me so much stimulation and so much help in my life early, when I may not have appreciated it openly, but I was still very, very grateful for it. So this is it is an important date. Now then, that being the case, we need to take a look at our subject matter. As you may recall, because of the Thanksgiving Day and various events of that sort, this month of November is we are somewhat short-changed in terms of lectures, and so we really only had 2 main lectures scheduled, for which I had chosen the topic of what I like to call symbolically the 2 pillars in the Temple of Solomon, the 2 pillars that hold up the Gnostic worldview and cosmology, namely the figure of the feminine figure and the masculine figure. And the feminine figure being the divine Sophia, the masculine figure being the symbol of Christ. And we have dealt with the Sophianic figure last Friday, and we will deal with the perhaps somewhat even more difficult figure of Jesus today. Now, when dealing with Gnostic figures, with figures of the Gnostic cosmoconception, to use once again Max Heindel's expression, which I think is a translation, his translation of Weltanschauung, cosmoconception, we may wish to keep in mind that the figure, this particular figure, the figure of Jesus, is probably the most prominent figure and the figure of the widest acceptance in both mythic and theological and moral and a whole number of other respects in the world. Even though, as I shall mention shortly, the principle of the coming to earth, the embodiment of a transcendental divine being, is by no means unknown in the religious history of the world. There is probably no figure, not even the Buddha, not even the avatars of Hinduism like Rama and Krishna, who have, let's say, exercised, at least outwardly, the kind of immense, all-encompassing influence as this figure who became nolens volens, as we put it in Latin, which means willing or unwilling, the founder of the Christian tradition. So that there is a certain unique quality to this figure, which has had tremendous influence, as we all can recognize, on the history of the world and on the peoples of the world. Now, that being understood, we shall take a look at this figure in the manner in which good Gnostics should, and that is, if you don't mind the spatial analogy, from the top down. In other words, we take a look at where in the transcendental realm, in the heaven world, in the totally non-material world, does it originate? Or where do we have the first account, the first news of this figure outside of this world? And then we may see as to how that same figure and that archetype comes down to earth and exercises a certain influence, and how all the immense interest and the many different approaches about this figure develop. Now, I think the most remote and at the same time probably also most endearing expression of the Christ figure, of the Jesus figure, occurs in the great, big, and certainly fabulously romantic and interesting book Pistis Sophia, which is like so many, practically all of the Gnostic scriptures, something that just all of a sudden was rediscovered, that popped up. Nobody knew about it before, not like Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John or so, but all of a sudden, and I probably mentioned that last time, when a British doctor, a medical doctor in London by the name of Dr. Askew died, they found this Coptic codex, in very well preserved Coptic codex in his possession, and it became probably you might say the principal avenue to Gnostic lore and to the gnosis of that particular time. Speaking of Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott, it of course arrested the attention of Madame Blavatsky, who impelled her good friend and secretary G.R.S. Mead, George R.S. Mead, whose photograph is actually back there on the wall, to translate it. And so his translation of the Pistis Sophia was the first, and I think is still the most insightful. The good reason for that being probably that he was a theosophist, and thus he already had an entry point into the gnosis. To him, the Gnostic myths were not some kind of external object, but something that, at least in spirit, he was already familiar with, and therefore could do such an insightful translation of that work and others. Now, pistis, by the way, in Greek means faithful. And so what we have here is the title is The Faithful Sophia. And we spoke about it last week, and the indication being that her myth, her story, is very largely characterized by the fact that in all her difficulties, in all her alienation from her original background and other problems, she remains faithful to her devotion to and her relationship to what she calls the light. And if I can very briefly recapitulate what I probably said last time, up in the lofty height in the pleromic world, in the world of transcendence, in the seventh aeon, even the number is given, which meaning the seventh region of that mysterious realm, there are to be found two beings, and they are Sophia and they are Jesus. There they are. And now Sophia, as you may recall, undergoes a difficult career because of her unswerving and relentless devotion to what she calls the light, which is really the essence of ultimate reality, sometimes called the Father of the Light, just sometimes the light, the transcendent light, that from whence, of course, she, with all the other aeonial beings in the Gnostic myths, have come, and to which she is utterly devoted. And while there in the seventh aeon, she catches a glimpse of what she thinks that is the light that she came from and that she is seeking. And then she sallies forth in order to go to that light, because it's not right where she is, it's in the distance. And in so doing, she undergoes many adventures, and many of them of unpleasant nature, an alienation rather than a coming close to her ultimate source, and a great deal of sorrow of a soul in exile. Now, perhaps I should abstain from becoming personal again, which it seems that in my old age or dotage I tend to be. Let's say I know something about exile. I have lived in it for many, many years, right up to the present time, from the time that I left my native land in December of 1947 to the present. And while I certainly should be valiant and say that after all I found a new home, I found what at that time was a very nice city, namely Hollywood and Los Angeles, that somehow I was still in exile, because our such historical or physical exiles, if we look at them with a more profound vision, become a metaphor for our condition in general. I ultimately came to recognize that I was not only exiled from my beloved homeland, but that in addition to that, on a larger scale, I was also and still am exiled from another homeland, a transcendental homeland, a divine homeland, a heavenly homeland, where I and the rest of you really belong, and from which, whether we know it or not, we have been exiled. So let's say the issue of exile is a very, very important one. It has to do with our being removed, or removing ourselves somehow from a place of authenticity, of reality, of truth, of what in Greek is called aletheia, the truth, and then our searching for it. Because in a deep psychological sense, and we could easily substantiate that with statements of great modern psychologists, especially C.G. Jung, that we are exiled from a condition of truth, a condition of authenticity, that we are missing out on something that we suspect, that we feel, that we intuit is there, and with which once we had an intimate contact, and lo and behold, now we don't. So this is the great human exile. We are all exiles, we are all in a cosmic Siberia. And that's a pretty rough thing to say. But on the other hand, let's say we have the ability and the calling, and we have assistance whereby that painful state of exile may be diminished and ultimately may be removed. So here is the, let's say, the archetypal symbol of Sophia having stepped out of the seventh aeon and now wandering about these mysterious regions, looking for what she lost, or what she thought she lost, namely the ultimate divine light. And on the other hand, on the same aeon, which are sort of the, let's say, the regions, or I don't know if you want to use sort of Blavatskyan terms for it, the planes, which I never liked very much, but especially when Blavatsky formulated that term, there were no planes in the air, so she could have do it more easily, you know. But in other words, various levels of being or levels of consciousness, there is another, and this other is the representative of the masculine divine principle, but also with great modification, and he is known even in the heavenly regions as the Anointed One, the Christos. And the Christos sees his friend Sophia leave her residence in the seventh eon. And he realizes that she went forth on a, I think that would be a much too trite an expression, a sort of, I don't know what would we call it, a chicken coop expression, to say that she went out on a wild goose chase. Are there wild goose chases in heaven? Well, I'm not going to pronounce on that. But in any event, she went forth and she goes region after region looking for that right and doesn't find it. Finally, who but her companion in the high aeons, the Anointed, the Christos, takes pity on her and says, look, we've got to restore Sophia to her proper place. And so he charges forth and goes looking for her. So it's, you know, this is a really romantic celestial story. And he eventually finds her. And meanwhile, she has gone all kinds of adventures, which we don't really know to go into this time. Probably the most disastrous of which is actually involves the creation of this world where we are. If there ever was a disaster in the history of the cosmos, it's the creation of this world. I am convinced of that. You know, if there ever was. In any event, you know, something happened which we shall deal with next month when we deal about the demiurge. But in any event, something really went wrong. And we live in it, in that thing that went wrong. And keeps going wrong. I mean, look what's going on. Yeah. It's just, you know, it's amazing. I mean, here in my, I was born just a decade or more after the end of World War I. I found myself very soon in life in World War II, and various other things. You know, I mean, this is not an easy place to journey, I can tell you, and I think that in various aspects of your life you will agree with me. In any event, the rescuer comes, and this is, of course, needs to be remembered that is his calling. In a German Christmas carol, which I always like, there is a translation, well, into German, of what is happening at Christmas. And the sentence that I always remembered, Christus der Retter ist da, Christus der Retter ist da. Christ, the rescuer, is here. to which someone once made a comment, and probably a fairly accurate one: what kind of a world is it where everything has to be rescued? So you just reflect on that a little bit here and there. Now, after putting down the world, so let's go back to the aeons again. And so Jesus finds Sophia, and he also finds that as far as she journeyed, the experiences that she had, all the balderdash that she went through, that she's really very far from the original light, and she really needs a lot of help. And so he gets the two great archangels, Michael and Gabriel, who come and who the way I envision it, which is purely my own imagination, they come and pick up Sophia under her armpits. They say, "Here, Sophie, let's go." And they take her back to her own aeon. And for which reason, the Gnostics would say, and being one I say myself, the overwhelming majority of the icons, both in East and in West, of the Blessed Virgin Mary, who is after all the earthly embodiment, the earthly representative of the Divine Sophia, you can see the two angels, the two archangels there. They are the ones who brought her back. So now Sophia is restored to her place, and from there, as time goes on, she can exercise her functions, which are very important and very great indeed. And all of this, plus a tremendous amount of additional material, explanatory material, poetic material, are all contained in the Pistis Sophia. And just to indicate what kind of psycho-spiritual ambience is in the Pistis Sophia, the framework of the story of it's a big book, a big thick book. Should have brought one with me. In any event, the keynote of the Pistis Sophia is that it's a story that is told by various people, including Jesus, by the apostles and the disciples after Jesus has gone up to heaven. And so, but Jesus is still there with them. So they are in a transcendental realm, and the sort of the one who carries the voice and who more or less invokes the presence of Sophia in terms of the story is Mary Magdalene. So the Pistis Sophia is the principal work, wherein the prominence of Mary Magdalene is greatly extolled. There is Jesus, and he asked them to tell, and then Mary Magdalene tells the story of Sophia. And after every chapter, so to say, then Jesus comments her and says, "That's right, Mary, you are the one who knows. You know how to tell the story." In a very complimentary manner, which one would conjecture that all the patriarchal apostles with their great wagging beards are probably a little bit offended. Well, here he always tells her how right she is, and he never tells us. But it's just an interesting element there. In any event, that's the mythic beginning. And the mythic beginning then indicates that obviously Jesus, the Jesus being in the heavens, now would make reference to and try to introduce some corrections into what has happened as the result of all the difficulties of Mary Magdalene. So now Jesus now goes forth, and I know this is maybe a little too mundane a metaphor. He now goes forth like a repairer to repair the damage that occurred to Sophia and to various other circumstances where Sophia was traveling, including what has happened on earth and had to do with the creation of the world, which, however, as I say, is a long story in itself and a somewhat dark one. What else do you expect? And therefore we shall refer to it at greater length next month. But let us say it's not really crystal clear, but in terms of the meaning it is present that Jesus goes forth into the lower worlds in order to repair the difficulties that have arisen when Sophia was there, and that he is possibly responding to Sophia's plight. He says, look where I went to all of these places, look all of these terrible things that have happened to me, so come and help. So there is a relationship of that sort that already exists, let us say, in the heaven world. All right. So that is the original mythic framework. This is not to say that the figure of Sophia, or certainly the figure of Jesus, does not occur then with great frequency in various scriptures afterwards, both canonical and Gnostic. But this is the mythic framework, and I never cease to emphasize that the message, the Gnostic message, the message of the Gnosis, needs to be understood primarily in mythic terms. Now, of course, we know what the nasty thing that the radio interviewer said to Joseph Campbell, that Mr. Campbell, why are you interested in myths? Everybody knows that a myth is a lie. Well, that is the point of view of the unimaginative, uninspired Dummkopfs, which would be the German word of this world, who can't see the truth when it looks into their faces. But look, it is still true. Let's see if you, I don't know, if you should organize a meeting of, I don't know, invite some people, and then you say that on a particular day you are going to tell them some of the Arthurian myths, and then another day you will tell them about what is it now, the latest balderdash, what they call it, IA or AI or what?
Artificial intelligence.
One of these things. Or which one is the one they are going to go for? Well, they are going to go for the electronic one. In any event, those are the human deficiencies. But let us say, now comes the mission, really, of the masculine principle, who, because of the historical circumstances surrounding his birth and his life, is usually referred to as Jesus, also Jesus of Nazareth, owing to the fact that apparently the historical Jesus spent most of his early years in the town of Nazareth. And what are we dealing with here? Once again, we are dealing with a Gnostic mythic figure. And no doubt the scholars would not like that so much, but let's say the Gnostic worldview, the Gnostic Weltanschauung has, to begin with, from its beginning, as we say in Latin, ab ovo, from the egg on. That's how the Romans will be egging you on. From the very beginning on, it has had the, let's say, the realization of the fact in the great cosmic and transcosmic view of things, of what I have called, along with some others, the messengers of light. And of course, the idea being that transcendental great beings with much spiritual influence, with great abilities to help the world, would from time to time come to this material creation and try to induce salutary spiritual changes there. Now, this in itself is not that unique, because they include certainly Jesus, they include Zarathustra, the Persian savior, another great Persian whose beautiful, inspiring writings I hope to, at least in part, recount and review in the next month, the prophet Mani, the other Persian prophet Zarathustra, and certainly Gautama the Buddha, are all messengers of light. In fact, so much so that Mani, for instance, who is a the most poetic, the most transcendentally glorious writer of spiritual poetry in the history of the world. When I read some of them to you next time, you will recognize that. But all of these are quite obviously messengers of light. So mythically, this has always been the best Gnostic communicating device, we might say. That someone, individual, comes from the realm of light and inspires the kindling of further lights here on earth, and bringing enlightenment as the result of that to people. Probably the most basic text of lyrical beauty we have dealt with not so very long ago in the Hymn of the Pearl, which is a mythic recounting as to how someone is sent from the highest heavens in order to accomplish a particular mysterious and mystical task here on earth, and then bring it back to heaven. So obviously we find equivalents in other cultures and other religious frameworks. For instance, as I mentioned before, the ancient Hindu religion, which is probably about with the Vedas, in things like that, is probably has the oldest scriptures in the world. We find the concept of avatars, which are embodiments of the gods, embodiments of the divine, who come to earth in order to accomplish certain tasks. And there are particularly two of these are mentioned and have great, big, epic, wonderful, epic scriptures written about them, and they are Krishna and Rama. Both of them are avatars, emissaries, emanations, whatever you want to call it, of the god Vishnu. While, of course, certainly Buddhism has Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in considerable profusion. If you look into much of Mahayana Buddhism, especially, let's say of the Tibetan variety or so forth, there are hierarchies and hierarchies of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in the higher regions who then become embodied as well. So there's again messengers of a transcendental world that come here in order to accomplish certain tasks. We might say then that the ancient world also, the pre-Christian world of the Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, and others, had its own avatars of sorts, sometimes openly proclaimed as such. People, men or women who were gods come down to earth, and sometimes in other ways. I have particularly developed a little personal mythology of my own, which I think I have sort of indicated a few times, that one of the latest avatars of the ancient world, of the so-called pagan world, was Alexander the Great. But now, don't ask me to prove that, because if you got me going on that, then we would never go home, or else we all would fall asleep here. In any event, you see, let's say the notion of the divine, the divine coming to earth in order to accomplish certain tasks is a common heritage of the human race. It is expressed in various ways, but I think there was a medieval theologian, trying to think which one it was now, who wrote a big treatise about that in Latin called Cur Deus Homo, which is the human, the divine and the human, how the divine can become incarnate in the human. So we might say that this is the framework within which the terrestrial mission of the celestial Jesus occurs and is recognized as such in the Gnostic mythos. So let's say there are avatars of the Gnosis, and that one of these avatars is the figure of Jesus. Now, Jesus is, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, Jesus was and is a historical figure. I know there was a time, particularly in the 19th century, where when people wanted to doubt everything and shock people with their doubting, when various people, including the great French writer Renan and others, they just came up with the idea that Jesus was a purely mythical figure. And of course, to them at that time, in the 19th century, which Carl Jung called the true Dark Ages, that meant that he was less than an actual human. But let us say that kind of pseudo scholarship has pretty much gone. You know, the scholars had a lot of fun. There was even a scholarly school, quite respected, that believed that Napoleon, the figure of Napoleon, was a solar myth. How do you like that? I'm sure that the Bonaparte family, of course the father died early, but with Napoleon's mother, who had all these children, whom then Napoleon made into kings of this and kings of that, and so forth, then she would have been very surprised to realize that her son was a solar myth. But they came up with some really weird stuff. There is no imagination as weird and as perverse as the scholarly imagination. Having been sort of bumped around in scholarly circles during some of my life, I think I can testify to that. So what we have then is, no, this was an actual historical figure, a Jewish boy, born probably in Bethlehem, and undergoing probably the majority of the experiences which are recounted in the New Testament in the course of his life. So there is no reason from a Gnostic point of view for us to doubt that or to deny that. The only thing that we need to keep in mind that all of this, the physical activities, even many of the speeches, even many of the miracles, let's say, attributed to Jesus are, well, how should we put it? They are part of the husk, and the real seed is hidden away. So we are dealing here with the New Testament Jesus, and then we are dealing with a particularly reduced and I wouldn't even mind saying trivialized figure of a great and mysterious being. And of course that trivialization goes on when the biblical scholars get hold of it, and nowadays even the preachers, who really, let's say, betray the transcendental nature of the one whom they proclaim as their Lord by trivializing so much about him. And this goes all the way from the Vatican to any other church in the neighborhood. There's a trivialization, a reductionism, a blasphemy really going on. But don't feel too bad about it because it's been going on for a long, long time. Clear back in post-apostolic times already, people were reducing this figure. And why? Probably largely because we don't really like outstanding figures who stand way, 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 way above us. We'd like other people who are our leaders, our teachers, our religious leaders. We'd like them to be like us, right? Now, wouldn't that be nice? I would say it would be terrible, because if our really great teachers are like us, then why look for them? Why listen to them? Why read their writings? See, to reduce great things and great beings to a lesser size, which is our size, I think is a terrible thing. If for no other reason, but there are many other reasons, is because, and I hope we can go into that next month, because it is a psycho-spiritual necessity for the human being to be able to look up to a greater reality than himself. If he can do that, well, let's say then, I don't know, maybe then reincarnation has to be true, because people like that really should come back and learn some more. That's it. So this is a great difficulty. We like to dwarf greatness. We can't stand greatness. And shrink it down to some minuscule size. But then, of course, a tremendous amount is lost. But if you should observe, shall we say, what has been going on, I would say at least for the last 50 years, but even the last 100 years, you will find that everywhere, including in the churches, this kind of reducing of the ineffable greatness, as it also manifests in Jesus Christ, has been going on. And this, I think, is a real betrayal of the calling of the priesthood and of the ministry that is deplorable. Because what did people do clear back into prophetic times and so forth when they were relating themselves to the divine? What kind of expressions did they use? What kind of poetry, what kind of psalms did they write? How great thou art, how great thou art. And instead of that, now we are trying to reduce the greatness to the littleness. We are trying to take away from it. When we do that, we are doing injury to the transcendental intentionality of reality. The ability to admit ineffable greatness and magnificence and glory and wisdom and goodness is the best thing that we can do. That is why, let's say, the great scholar of mythic literature and the master of Joseph Campbell, Heinrich Zimmer, wrote in his large book, which was maybe not so very accurately the title translated as Philosophies of India. He said, if you really want to get the spirit of India, then you should read the Ramayana, read the Mahabharata. In other words, the poetry, the mythology, that is the one that really conveys the spirit. Because otherwise, he didn't use that term, but it's a good term to use. Otherwise, a lot of the books, and I read more of them than I should have, probably about Hinduism, is a kind of spiritual bookkeeping. Oh, and then there's this, and there's this God, and there is that God, and there's this principle, and that goes on and on and on and on. And you wonder, well, what is this stuff all about? But if you listen, it sounds better in Sanskrit, which I don't really know, but one of my good friends was a Sanskrit professor who would sing and recite portions of the Mahabharata, Krishna telling about himself and scaring the living daylights out of Arjuna. Even when you don't understand the words, you can't translate them. You say something awesome, something incredible is being communicated, and what that means is that awesomeness, that weirdness is the important thing. Not, from a Western point of view, people expect, so what are the commandments? that you shouldn't eat cow, where most Hindus adhere to that, but the essence of the revelation, the essence of the religion is transcendental. It's weird. It's non-terrestrial and inhuman. Otherwise, why should you bother with it? If it's just the same kind of balderdash that we experience here on earth, and says, oh, well, you shouldn't do this, you should eat this but not eat that, and you should be faithful to your wife and whatnot. Not that those things are not valuable in themselves. Is that the essence of a religion? Is that something that will lead you to God? Balderdash. But when you catch the poetry of the religion, that is why there are so many psalms, and that's why the psalms of the Old Testament, so many of them are so magnificent. We used to recite them back home in Latin. And there is one that I never forgot, just the initial, and that it says, Dixit incipiens in corde suo non est Deus. The fool saith in his heart that there is no God. Things like that. These things, you may not even go along with it, he says. Well, okay, then I'm a fool. And we say, okay, hello, fool. But the issue is that there has to, because in the poetry, in the myth, in the story, in the Ramayana or in the Mahabharata, there is an energy that you cannot find in prosaic literature. And it's something we should keep in mind. It's something that I have, let's say, when I said I used to argue with all the various older people here in the Besant Lodge, it was one of the things that I was arguing about, because that's what we need for theosophy is poetry. What we need is imagination, feeling. That is what we need. And not, oh no, there are seven principles of physical nature and the astral nature and the things. Who cares? I don't. You see? And we need to keep that in mind, because without that feeling, without that energy, then you're static, you're not going anywhere. It's the energy of the psyche with its longing, with its desire, with its love, that carries you off. That is what gives wings to your effort. Instead of that, we so often, in religion and in other fields of endeavor, instead of being winged creatures, we have become worms that crawl on the ground. And you know what? To me, at least, that's not a very attractive image. I don't want to be a worm, So these things are. Why is Blavatsky still so influential? Why could someone like Manly Hall on Los Feliz Boulevard write that take away the contribution of H.P. Blavatsky and all of modern occultism falls like a house of cards? You might call it now all of the esoteric tradition.
Is that true?
I think it's true, because her formulation was such, at least in my opinion, such a unique combination of high feeling and high knowledge. You see, her gnosis was a gnosis of feeling, a gnosis of devotion, a gnosis that you could tell in so many of her writing. This old Russian woman with her cigarettes, knows something. What she talks about, she knows. She has communed with it. She has been there. Now, of course, people can make up for it by saying, oh yeah, because it's a master so-and-so. You know where I'll come to it later, where the master is, voila, that's where it is, and that's where hers was too. And I'll give you a good quotation from her if I don't take all day. But the issue is that there must be a feeling-toned, poetic and mythic aspect to these things. Because that is what picks you up from the ground. That is what takes you to higher places. And if that's not there, then you haven't got much. And it doesn't mean that the person who enunciates these things that I'm talking about has to be a saint or a terribly wise philosopher, you know. I knew a man who was one of my teachers who had so many faults that they came out all over the place. But he had the capacity to communicate the feeling of the gnosis. When he spoke, it was pouring out of him. If he spoke, you knew that he was speaking truth. And this is extremely important. And it would seem, according to the multifarious testimonies, that such a person was Jesus of Nazareth. Now, from a Gnostic point of view, you might ask, of course, all right, if Jesus was a messenger from above and so forth, then did he descend into the human Jesus? And if so, when? Well, you know, already in very early apostolic times, there was quite a bit of arguing about that, because part of Christendom, probably the more Gnostic type, said that the full transcendental spirit of the Christ descended into Jesus at his baptism in the river Jordan at the hands of John the Baptizer, which is not to say that it wasn't there before, but that was the actual manifestation. And once again, it doesn't make all that much difference. But there are indications, the only reason I bring this up, there are indications in the very New Testament, in the canonical New Testament. You know, canonical means in the book. And those were the scriptures of the Christian church that were entered into the big book that was used in the church, just the canon. There it was. So even in the canonical materials, there is a great deal of indication of transcendental, mysterious and miraculous elements. Similarly, we might say that many other events that are recounted in the New Testament, and now, of course, fortunately, we have an increasing number of Gnostic Gospels, some of which we have dealt with before, Gospels such as Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Truth, Gospel of the Egyptians, and other scriptures, which indicate this transcendental character, which, let's say, make the proposition that this was a transcendental being coming from afar to this world to accomplish certain purposes, makes it really quite credible. Now, what about, after all, there are so many details There are so many dogmas, there are so many biblical statements that we could be here forever and probably remember forever to remain in boredom if we were to try to recount them all. But let us say that we might pick a few right now and then, namely that if we look at it with the eyes of Gnosis, or with the third eye of Shiva, or whatever you want to call it, the eye that looks beyond external appearances, then we can see that there are levels and levels of transcendental depth, of spiritual message, of interior transformative force and energy in so many of the biblical stories attributed to Jesus, that right there we can see that we are dealing with somebody from out of this world. So, well, let's say, one can more easily deal with the beautiful and the lyrical and the poetic parts, like the Christmas story. I haven't really encountered anybody, not even the wildest communists whom I don't want to encounter, although I was among them, who, let's say, makes a big deal out of denying Christmas. Well, okay, you want to believe in that, that's okay, but you really got to believe in Karl Marx and Lenin and all that. But obviously, hardly anybody would oppose that. But when it comes to some others, like what in the New Testament is certainly depicted, I'll give some indications as to how it may be interpreted, as the death and then the resurrection. Then you are dealing with a little more difficult subjects. And however, let me indicate that even though I grew up among crucifixes, and I never had any objection to them, I have one on the end of my rosary right now. But in Hungary, in the countryside, I don't know if this is of interest to you or not, but I'll tell you just the same. Out in the countryside, you always run into crossroads, and two roads cross each other. Right? And the crossroad has always been regarded as a magical place. You don't want to be out on the crossroad. Now, this is not me talking, but a Hungarian countryman talking. You don't want to be out on the crossroad at midnight or at noon. Because at that point, the worlds are go into each other into the place for witches and all kinds of strange things, and you just shouldn't be out there at that time. So for this reason, at every crossroad in the country, it is of course before communist times, there was a crucifix. Life-size crucifix with a little roof over it, and people came by, they saluted the crucifix, and every day, even in the wintertime, there were some gifts of flowers, of greenery or something that people brought. And it's not just what in German we might call alte Betschwestern, old ladies who all they do is pray, but it was really, let's say, a matter of popular custom. Now, I admit, it's not a very impressive sight to see that often desiccated-looking body on a cross bleeding. But if you have once again, if you have a little deeper insight and you're able to look behind these things, you may find that maybe, just maybe, that dying, desiccated body there is you, is humanity, is the suffering humanity within which we live. And that what we need to perhaps look for is to recognize that. I can't recall the poem, but there is a poem that speaks of the crucifixion, and which ends with the. I think it is. In any event, I don't need to mention the author at this point. Good poetry, and says, "God in man is crucified." Now, what does that mean? Something great, something magnificent, something capable of a resurrection, something that comes from the highest source is nailed to this body, nailed to this external reality, the body of the world. And its blood and its substance is pouring out on this darkened world. And yet somehow in all that, in that suffering and in that death, there is something great, something very, very important. Because by way of experiencing this, by way of comprehending this at a really, really deep level, we can rise from that. And like the example, Imitatio Christi, very famous book, The Imitation of Christ, by the example that is set for us, we can resurrect. We can resurrect. We no longer have to be nailed to the four directions and to earth, water, fire, and air, because we have discovered within us the ability that once we experience that, once we understand that, once we have a Gnostic understanding and relationship of a very Buddhist character of the sufferings of this world, once we truly understand the sufferings of this world and as it affects us, then something within us will overcome that suffering. And there are examples of that galore in various places. So let's say, don't be put off by the bleeding crucifix, let's say in the little Mexican church somewhere, because in this country, of course, the Anglo people are too squeamish, they are too pure to go for that. But, maybe it's you. Maybe something inside of you is there. Something there that longs not for death, but longs for resurrection. But that before the resurrection, there often must be a death. So, similarly, the resurrection is a symbolic mystery rather than a physical miracle. Now, here is, of course, a great problem, and it better not be too long a problem. Yeah. Here is the great problem, and the great problem is that Christianity was really a mystery teaching, and more than that, it was. I will conclude with that. It was a mystery practice, but what happened was that a lot of people who were not particularly capable of relating themselves to the mystery got into the fold. They came out of the forests of Saxony and elsewhere, where they have been fed on acorns and things like that. You know, just very primitive people. No, that's racist, you know, how can you say that? No, it's just a recognition that there are people whose psychological makeup is of one kind or the other in this case, and who came in, became very numerous. I have somebody just sent me a great big book of the early Goths when they took over Rome and so forth, that they are not of the kind of mind that readily takes to the mystical aspect of what is going on. So it says, look, this God came to earth and then they tortured him and they killed him and made him bleed and so forth. Well, okay, we got to feel sorry for him and we'll pray, you know. So let's say the literal interpretation of Scripture that was available was present because of the literal mindedness and the lack of mystical and poetic depth of the majority of the people who came to the religion. And consequently, we ended up with interpretations of the Christian mystery which are unfortunate and which would not need to be there, and which could be transmuted into a greater depth and a greater salvific power. But these things happen, and I think that it may be useful by this time for me to introduce another element of which we have a good deal of evidence now, but which has always been a tenet of Gnostics and similar weird folk, and that being that whatever else his activities may have been, whatever else his teachings may have been, because there is no doubt about it that we might say that there were at least two, I better bring that there were at least two modes of this particular savior figure interacting with the people. And one was as a teacher. And you find it in the New Testament, and all of those teachings, if they haven't been corrupted, are good, and they are helpful, and in fact, I wish that they were implemented and practiced more in our present secular world, and we would have a better world. He was a good teacher. He was teaching good things, and he taught them in a good way. But in addition to that, and that is an aspect that always remains to a greater or lesser extent a secret, he was an initiator into the transcendental mystery. And no doubt when Gnostics said such things, they were considered heretics, but there is more and more evidence arising to that effect, and I'll just mention one. Let's see where. In 1958, which is quite a while back, an American scholar by the name of Morton Smith, in Mount Saba Monastery in the Sinai, I believe it is, which is now in present-day Israel, discovered a remarkable scripture. It was a fragment of a letter from the 2nd century church father Clement of Alexandria, himself a very Gnosticizing figure. Is one of the great early church fathers, I would say, whom we have to regard as an honorary Gnostic, was dear old Clement. And Clement of Alexandria, in a letter that he wrote to a friend of his named Theodore, good Greek name, Theodorus, which discusses a secret version of the Gospel of Mark. Now, it would take me much too long to go into any details, but this is what this primarily concerns is either the actual story or its close duplicate of the raising of Lazarus. Now, you may recall from the New Testament the way the raising of Lazarus is depicted. Jesus comes to this town and the people there are sad because their fellow citizen and the brother of these two ladies, also by the name of Lazarus, has died. He's lying in the grave, and so Jesus goes there. He raises Lazarus out of the grave, and they walk away. So it's a reanimating of a dead body. Now, in this, I won't go into the details, but in this particular passage and the interpretation by Clement of the story of Lazarus, it is quite plain, and by now pretty much admitted by all the scholars, that what it depicts is an initiation ceremony wherein the person, the initiate, pretends to be dead, is lying in a grave. There are such initiations going on today. If there are any of, let's say, my lodge brothers around, they know what I am talking about. Only that was not the grave over there, the grave of Hiram Abiff, but it was the grave of Lazarus. So Jesus ceremonially takes Lazarus out of the grave, and it even mentions that Lazarus calls out to him from the grave. Oh, Master, Son of God, I'm here, help me. And then this one, okay, come on, fellow. He gets him by the hand and pulls him out, and they go away. They go away to Lazarus' house, and there is only the two of them, and there's a long, apparently, an all-night initiation going on. Lazarus has now been transformed and resurrected, and Jesus says goodbye and goes away. So what do we have here? We have apparently the example of an initiation ceremony. The metaphor that the uninitiated person, the person whose spirit has not been called forth, is dead spiritually and needs to be resurrected, was a common one in the mystery traditions of the Mediterranean area. So we have now a very evident proof, in addition to others, that such initiatory activities went on with Jesus, and the discovery in 1958 was definitely of that order. So now we begin to see that on the one hand we have the teacher who teaches very good things that are good for people and good for society, and we wish that they were better known and maybe practiced even today. But on the other hand, there is also the Hierophant, the initiator, who in secret, because that is the only way that it can be done, confers upon those whom he wishes the deeper mysteries of the Spirit, the equivalence in a new and different form, and probably in a more Judaic format of what? Of the same kind of mysteries that were administered in Eleusis, the Dionysian mysteries, the mysteries of Isis and others, which all involve a pretense, a temporary death, and then a coming back to a new life. And this has all too little been emphasized, although certainly there are already by now about 2 or 3 books about the secret gospel of Mark. One of them, a very recent one, that now more and more moving in that direction, indicating that these are the documentations of Christ, the initiator, Christ, the one who takes the individual into a higher kind of consciousness. Now, many, many more things could be said, but let us say if we look at the evidence of the Gnostic transmission of one kind or the other, going clear back to the time of Saint Clement of Alexandria, because he is one of the great Eastern Church Fathers, and we find that these rules tacitly or overtly were acknowledged by the best, the most informed, the most transcendentally oriented, the most devout leaders of the Christian community. Now, so we have now an increasing body of evidence indicating that we are not only a teacher whose teachings also in many ways are much more profound and very different from what the teachings of the church became later on. All you have to do is read the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Philip, and you see what different teachings the teacher has put forth, but that he was also an initiator who was, when so inclined, able to take people into the spiritual realm, make them experience a transcendental world, and be thereby transformed. Now, time is moving along with us, and certainly this is a big subject. But I just came across almost without searching for it, a passage of an essay written by H.P. Blavatsky in 1887, which is entitled "The Esoteric Character of the Gospels." It's small. It was probably not much more than a long article or something of that sort. But now here is just one paragraph, and how that matches with some of these discoveries. The coming of Christ, in parentheses, means the presence of Christos in a regenerated world, and not all of the actual coming in body of Christ Jesus. This Christ is to be sought, and this is the really important part, not in the wilderness, nor in the inner chamber, nor in the sanctuary of any temple built by men, for Christ, the true esoteric Savior, is no man, but the divine principle in every human being. He who strives to resurrect the spirit crucified in him by his own terrestrial passions, and buried deep in the sepulchre of his sinful flesh, he who has the strength to roll back the stone of matter from the door of his own inner sanctuary, he has the risen Christ in him. And this is H.P. Blavatsky. Now here is the ultimate solution. The solution is that that's where it is. That when we deal with this mystery of the teacher of Nazareth, if we are sensitive enough, if we are intuitive enough, we come to the point where we recognize the spirit of that messenger of light who has come here, and how that spirit, at least in part, is also in us. We recognize the localization of the transcendental spirit. We recognize that that is where we have to look for him. And isn't that what we find in the writings of St. Paul when he speaks of the Christ in you, the hope of glory? Of course. So once again, now from the angle of the story of the Christian story, and now let me remind us that owing to the historical circumstances of the way civilizations move around and spread and so forth, I would hazard a somewhat educated guess that the one prophet, the one savior figure of the history of the world, whose message, whose initiatory power, whose influence has extended farther in the world than any other, was the figure of Jesus. Why? Because the people who were Christians then carried the message everywhere, and the ships went to India, and the ships went to China, and the ships went to Australia, and they took the Christian message. So I don't mean to say it was a miracle, but a miracle of sorts it was. A very, very important transmission of spiritual power and of understanding. And if we take that to heart, along with Blavatsky, then we can see that the outer teacher, the outer Hierophant, the one who pulled Lazarus out of the grave, mystically, inwardly, within us, coming from the very deepest regions of our own being, of our own soul and heart, can stand there beside that grave that we think is our body, beside the sepulchre that we think that this is our world, and reach out his hand and take us unto himself. And we will have the same experience that they had in classical antiquity, wherein it was said by none other than Cicero, whom I always quote, after all, the greatest lawyer of the ancient world. Who else can you count? When he said that those who went through the complete initiations of the Eleusinian mysteries had totally lost the fear of death. Now, when you can do something like that, that's really remarkable. This can also happen to us in other ways. Even we may lose the fear and the revulsion of the death that we call life, which I would dearly like to lose. Even if we are lifted to levels of understanding that ordinarily are not available to us, and that can take us then through life or death or resurrection, through our own baptisms in the River Jordan, everywhere, because we have received the power that this initiator has brought from above, and that graciously and joyously he has communicated to us. This can be done. And even in the exoteric church, even in the, let's say, in what Christendom has become to such a large extent, if we look for it, is there. That is why we have a Eucharistic church service here on Sunday morning, because one of the places where the remnant, where the vestige of that initiatory system is present is in the seven sacraments, beginning with baptism and proceeding ultimately to the partaking of the God in Holy Communion. So there is still something here. It hasn't gone away. What he has brought is still here. It has been guarded. I can testify to it, that it has been guarded by the angels, and it has been guarded by those few of us who have been called to do the same. Because some of us know, as the angels know, that something really, really very, very profound is present here. Something that if we devote ourselves to it, if we treat it reverently, will change us. Change us will change us as much as the wine at the wedding of Cana. We can be transformed, we can be changed, we can be sanctified if we open up to it. Because this teacher, this Hierophant, has brought some of these matters to us, and in a mystical manner he is still here, as all the others are. If you go to some of the Buddhist temples down in Japanese town and over there, I used to go to Koyasan temple years ago. There are some there. There is a Buddha there. There is a living presence there, because the great ones mystically never go away. They remain here because they came to do something for us and in us. And if we open up ourselves with our cooperation, with our welcoming, they will accomplish what they came for. And won't that be a glorious, a wonderful, a tremendous day and time? It may happen, and to a large extent it is up to us. If we open ourselves up to this, then it can happen. And then all of these great ones, including the Christos, the anointed from above, have not come in vain. And maybe it's quite important that we prove that they have not come in vain, to prove it to us, and ultimately to prove it to this darkened but yet redeemable world. So I thank you very much, and I hope you'll be here next time.
Thank you.